Iran is blaming Israel for a power blackout at its main nuclear facility, calling it an act of nuclear terrorism. It happened as diplomatic efforts to revive the 2015 nuclear deal are set to resume. So how will this incident affect negotiations? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Darine Abougeda. Iran is promising revenge for Sunday's power blackout at the Natanz nuclear facility. Iran's foreign minister has described it as sabotage. And Israeli media are quoting unnamed intelligence sources saying Israel's Mossad spy service was behind it. The incident comes just a day after advanced centrifuges for uranium enrichment were unveiled, but also as the Iranians are set to resume indirect talks with the U.S. to revive the 2015 nuclear deal. Now, Israel has long opposed that accord. Asad Beg sets it all up for us with this report from Tehran.
Nuclear terrorism is how Iran has described this latest incident at its main enrichment facility, pointing the finger at Israel.
What happened in Natanz, as Israel's officials have said it several times, and what we are hearing from different sources, it confirms that Israel was behind this incident.
US media said it was an explosive device and not a cyber attack. Although they quoted unidentified intelligence sources, there's still very little information out of Iran about how the attack was carried out.
In my view, without a doubt, this is definitely not a coincidence. And one thing you need to remember, while it is Israel is the usual suspect in these events over the last few years, one must be mindful there are many opponents in many different corners to the resumption of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, not the least of which is from within Iran itself.
Iran is now urging the International Atomic Energy Agency to take action, saying it reserves the right to punish the perpetrators. This development comes at an important time as Iran prepares to return to Vienna for talks. Negotiations about the 2015 nuclear agreement started last week, with indirect talks between Tehran and the United States. President Joe Biden says he's willing to rescue the deal that was abandoned 3 years ago by his predecessor Donald Trump. That is, if Iran comes into compliance with the deal. There's now been 2 attacks against the Natanz nuclear facility in the space of a year. And Israel has also been blamed for the assassination of Iran's lead nuclear scientist and last week's attack against an Iranian ship in the Red Sea. This latest incident has yet again raised questions about the country's ability to protect its facilities. Iran has always boasted about its nuclear achievements and capabilities, leverage it wants to use in negotiations. Just days ago, state television aired a music video promoting its nuclear program. But for now, it's unclear how much damage has been inflicted and how far back the program has been set. Asad Beg for Inside Story.
Iran was top of the agenda during the U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin's visit to Israel, where he met Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
Mr. Secretary, we both know the horrors of war. We both understand the importance of preventing war, and we both agree that Iran must never possess nuclear weapons. My policy as Prime Minister of Israel is clear. I will never allow Iran to obtain the nuclear capability to carry out its genocidal goal of eliminating Israel. And Israel will continue to defend itself against Iran's aggression and terrorism.
Let's now bring in our guest. Joining us from Tehran is Mohammed Morandi, who's the chair of American Studies at the University of Tehran. In Tel Aviv, Meir Javedanfar, the Iranian politics lecturer at the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya. And in Washington, D.C., Hillary Mann Leverett, who's a former U.S. diplomat, and she's also the co-author Going to Tehran. Welcome to the program. Thanks so much for your time with us on Al Jazeera. Hillary, I'll start with you. American and Israeli intelligence officials in both the U.S. and Israeli media, as you've been hearing, are pointing to an Israeli role when it comes to this attack in Iran. If so, what do you think the purpose is behind it? Is it to set back Iran's nuclear program, or is it to set back diplomacy as these nuclear talks are set to resume this week?
I think it is very much to set back diplomacy. There's no evidence that anything that Israel has done over the years has set back Iran's nuclear program. Quite the contrary, I think it has acted as a catalyst to push Iran further forward in its nuclear program. So I think it is very much about scuttling diplomacy, showing not only Iran, but maybe even more so the Biden administration, that it will not allow, as Israeli officials have said repeatedly, allow this kind of JCPOA to be reconstituted in a way that Israel doesn't accept. So I think the Israelis have said that, Israeli officials have said that clearly publicly, and I would take them at their word on this one.
So are you saying that this is not only a message to Iran, but also the U.S. and the Biden administration?
I do. I think it is very much a message to the Biden administration. That said, I don't think we can discount the Biden administration's support for Israel. The Biden administration has made very clear that it is going to very much fulsomely support Israel. Our Secretary of Defense was in Israel as this attack was being launched by the Israelis. So, and there's a high-level working group that's been publicly disclosed to the press between Israeli and American intelligence and security officials. So it puts the United States very much in a bind, because even if the United States did not partake in this operation, as U.S. officials have tried to say overnight, even if the United States did not partake in them, did the United States somehow have advance warning? Does it benefit? Israeli press reports say that U.S. officials are satisfied with what the Israelis have done. Either way, it puts the United States in a very bad position in any resumption of talks over Iran's nuclear program.
Mohammed Morandi, how is this attack being seen in Iran?
People basically believe that this was carried out with U.S. support because all Israeli acts of terror and sabotage have been carried out with support from U.S. military bases surrounding Iran, U.S. embassies, and sometimes other embassies. And we also have a history where IAEA inspectors have passed on sensitive intelligence to Western intelligence agencies who then pass it on to the Israeli regime. So whether Biden himself knew about it or not, there's always still the possibility that the Pentagon and the CIA went behind his back, as we saw repeatedly during the Trump regime. So whether Biden knew about it or not, it really doesn't make a difference. As Hillary pointed out, the very fact that the Americans have spoken of their satisfaction shows that when they want to talk, they are still willing to be violent and to support acts of war against Iranian people. So that does not help any talks. And I think it creates an incentive, or let me put it this way, it destroys any incentive for Iranians to negotiate in order to implement the nuclear deal.
We'll get to Iran's stance on the negotiations in a moment, but Meir, let me bring you in here. What do you think about the U.S.'s position in particular when it comes to this attack? I mean, would it have been notified of this attack by Israel? The accusation is Israel was behind it by Iran, or would Israel have done this alone and gone against Biden's wishes?
I think the fact that the attack took place a day before the arrival of the U.S. Secretary of Defense makes it probable that Israel informed the United States and had the United States tacit approval. Because to undertake such an action, if Israel was behind this attack, to undertake it a day before the U.S. Secretary of Defense arrives in Israel would be quite risky if the Americans were not informed of such a plan. And I think, in a way, this helps the United States, this attack. Please allow me to explain. During the negotiations, the Iranian regime, through its proxies in Iraq, has been attacking American forces. We see a number of attacks. I think there have been 3 attacks recently, and America has only recently retaliated once. So the Iranian regime has tried to use its proxies to pressure the Americans in the nuclear talks. Then we saw recently that they brought advanced centrifuges. And that's another pressure point, which now it seems that they no longer have it, judging by the New York Times report. This has been set back by a number of months. I think what is important to note is that there have been 2 attacks in the press that have been attributed to Israel in the last year, both of them at Natanz, and both of them have been at the places where Iran has either assembled or installed advanced centrifuges. And that also seems to be a new red line for the state of Israel for the nuclear program in Iran.
But as Hillary was saying just a moment ago, Meir, Israel has, and you just said, Israel has reportedly attacked Iran in the past. It's conducted cyber attacks. It's also reportedly assassinated some of the Iranian nuclear scientists. And nothing has changed when it comes to the trajectory of the Iranian program. And Iran hasn't altered its timeline in any significant way. So do the Israelis think that this time would be any different?
I think if Israel were behind those attacks, I think this has actually created a deterrence. This is one of the reasons I think that ultimately Iran came to the negotiation table in 2015. That if it realized that if it wants to make a nuclear weapon, we have to remember, Dareen, that in 2003 it was Israeli intelligence that informed the international community about Iran's secret facility in Natanz, which, according to IAEA rules, was illegal, that Iran had not informed the Americans and the IAEA in the legal time frame. And Mr. al-Baradei said Iran was on the wrong side of the law then. I think it seems this is part of, if these attacks are attributed to Israel, these are parts of a campaign of Israel of sanctions, supporting sanctions in the United States through its allies, and these actions against the regime which basically since 1990 declared war against the state of Israel, proxy war, but it's still war. So these seems to be parts and parcels of Israel's tools to deal with the threat from the Iranian regime. I wish we could negotiate with Iran, but unfortunately its regime not only doesn't recognize Israel's right to exist, it hosts Holocaust cartoon competitions. It somehow finds the Holocaust funny enough to host cartoon competitions, so it makes it impossible to negotiate with them. Therefore, other means are applied.
Mohammed Morandi, would you like to weigh in on this? And do you share the point of view that this may be a way for Israel to kind of have indirect leverage at the talks, in the sense that it's trying to complicate the decisions of the other members when it comes to the nuclear talks?
In general, I wouldn't take the propaganda that the Israeli regime promotes very seriously. First of all, in 2015, the Iranians didn't go to the negotiating table because of any pressure. It was because the United States under Obama accepted Iran's right to enrichment in the talks in Oman. In 2003, the information was MEK, the terrorist organization, and while al-Baradei said that Iran, because of a technicality, was on the wrong side of the law, his legal advisor said actually Iran wasn't violating the law. So there was never ever any evidence that Iran was pursuing a nuclear weapon, unlike the apartheid regime in Palestine, which has lots of nuclear weapons, and unlike the apartheid regime that constantly carries out acts of violence against neighboring countries in Syria, killing Syrian soldiers, in Gaza, and so on. So that aside, it's quite clear that, as your guest Hillary pointed out, that these exaggerated attacks, they are not going to have any impact on the Iranian position. It will harden the Iranian position. In fact, the New York Times article was wrong. The advanced centrifuges were not in that particular hall. And this will come out because when inspectors go and see it, they will see the IR9, the IR8, the IR6, and the IR5 centrifuges. They will be working. So propaganda can only work for a period of time. So the old centrifuges, which were damaged in one of the halls, because there are 4 or 5 halls at Natanz, those will be replaced with highly advanced centrifuges. And that is one of the Iranian responses to the Israeli regime. Other responses will come out later on with, the Iranians are patient. And I think that the changing of the map in the region, where Iran and its allies have been on the rise despite maximum pressure campaigns and despite the atrocities carried out by the Americans across the board, we see that the Iranians and their allies in the region today are far more influential than they were 10, 15, 20 years ago. So I think,
but going into these talks, just a moment ago, you said that Iran would harden its position. But what is your viewpoint on what they're going to do next when it comes to the talks? Will they just resume them, go back to business as normal, or do they go in a little bit undermined because of this incident?
The only thing that is undermined is the incentive to talk. The point, first of all, the Iranian position is clear, and that is that the Americans, if they want the nuclear deal to work, if they want Iran to implement its side of the bargain, the Americans have to implement their side of the bargain, and that has to be verified. Iran is not going to accept some of the sanctions to remain in place, the sanctions that Trump imposed, or even the sanctions that Obama imposed after the deal was signed. Those are violations. If Iran wanted to appease anyone, they would have appeased Trump. They're not going to appease a much weaker Biden after all that's been going on in the United States. So the conditions that Iran has set are clear. If the Americans want the deal, they have to abide by it. Otherwise, they can't expect Iran to do anything. But on the other hand, the Iranians, people in Iran, are seeing that the United States is behaving violently. It won't rein in the mad dog in Tel Aviv, and it expresses its pleasure in assassinations and terrorist attacks in Iran. That is not something that will increase the incentive in Tehran, whether among politicians, even so-called moderates and reformists, and it will not increase the incentive among the general population either.
Okay, Hillary, Iran is saying that it will seek revenge, but does it now find itself in a bit of an awkward situation right before the resumption of nuclear talks? On the one hand, it says it feels compelled to retaliate, but on the other hand, it does have to balance that against the backdrop of the talks taking place, which Iran obviously has a huge stake in.
I think it's actually Washington that really is now in not just an awkward position, but in a really serious, really serious trouble in terms of pursuing diplomacy. We are in a similar situation. I mean, we don't have to presume very much. We can look back at history. We're in a similar situation that the Obama administration was when the Israelis went about killing Iranian nuclear scientists on the streets of Tehran. There were, I think, 4 or 5 Israeli murders of Iranian scientists at that time, and it was such a big problem for the United States that U.S. intelligence officials were backgrounding, very thinly veiled, backgrounding major media outlets here in Washington that it was the Israelis, and it put the Obama administration in a position where it had to seek diplomacy with Iran almost at any cost, otherwise face an Israeli-instigated war, which Obama did not want. We are in a similar situation where the Israelis, perhaps in concert with some in the U.S. administration, are pushing the Biden administration into this very serious choice: go along with war with the Israelis against Iran, or pursue real serious diplomacy with the real lifting of all sanctions that Trump imposed, as the Iranians have been clearly saying now for some time. So the Biden administration, I think, is in a much more difficult position than it was even a week ago, and in a similar position that it was under the Obama administration. It wasn't sanctions that brought Iran to the table. It was this choice that the United States had to have: make a real, solid, concrete concession to Iran in terms of saying that we recognize their right to enrich uranium domestically, or go along with an Israeli-instigated war. Obama decided that that was not worth it for the United States, and there's a good chance Biden will also think it's not worth going to war. But Prime Minister Netanyahu is pushing Biden to make that choice, and he may have some support within the Biden administration, but at the end of the day, will President Biden really do that? It's an open question.
Meir, do you agree with that assessment? And what do you think Netanyahu's end game is here with Iran? Is it to trigger a war?
Well, first of all, I hope there's going to be a negotiated settlement. I supported the JCPOA in 2015. Although afterwards there was some things that were done by the Iranian regime, such as testing of 2 ballistic missiles in March 2016, when 3 months after the deal went into effect, and they wrote on it that Israel must be wiped off the face of the earth. But I still hope that there's going to be a negotiated settlement. I disagree with Hillary's assessment here. Biden is not under pressure more than Iran. It is the Iranian government that only has $4 billion left in its account, accessible foreign reserves, according to the IMF, not the United States. It is the Islamic Republic, which is through massive mismanagement, it's so unpopular these days. If you're Persian speaking, you just go on the social media, you see the way the people are so angry by the mismanagement and the corruption of the country, of the huge abuses of human rights. So it's the Iranian regime that's under pressure here, not Biden. Biden can take his time, and I don't agree with this assessment that first of all, as I said, I hope there's going to be an agreement, but not every time that Iran does something, and then when America or Israel does something in return, people say, "Oh, Israel and America want war, and this is going to lead to war." Suddenly, they say there's going to be war. When Iran does something, they don't talk about war. But I don't agree that Iran is going to go to war for a very important reason. History has taught us that Iran prefers to fight proxy wars against the state of Israel. As I said, in October 1990, Iran, after the Madrid peace talks, declared proxy war against the state of Israel. It uses Hamas, Hezbollah, and Islamic Jihad to fight Israel. Why? Because Iran does not want direct war against the state of Israel, because it would most probably lose. Now, I hope that never happens. So I don't agree that Iran is going every time.
Let's just bring in, for the sake of time, Mohammed, I'll allow you to respond. Go ahead from Tehran.
Yes, again, one of the dishonest things that the Israeli regime constantly repeats is this whole issue of annihilating Israel. The Iranian position has always been that the Israeli regime must cease to exist as an apartheid regime. That has always been Iran's policy. The Israeli regime knows it. And in future,
that is a lie, Mr. Marandi. You're lying. There's written evidence to show you're lying. There's written evidence in Farsi to show you're lying, Mr. Marandi.
One day they'll pretend that they were opposed to apartheid in the first place. But I think it's quite obvious that the United States knows that Iran today is far more powerful than it was 10, 20 years ago. And the United States has to be very careful about that. Iran's rival in this region is not the Israeli regime or the Saudis. They are all completely dependent on the United States. And the United States has huge internal problems, and its allies in the region have huge problems. Netanyahu is a symbol of corruption. He wants to stay out of jail. And part of the reason why he intensifies tension across the board is because he wants to stay out of jail. But the Americans have to make a choice. Do they want to spend more trillions of dollars in this region at a time when their economy is facing such severe pressures and where the combined amount of bailout money that they have spent is less than the money that they've wasted in this region and have lost influence as a result? So the decision is that of the United States. Iran will not give up its sovereignty, and Iran will continue to oppose the apartheid regime, just like it opposed apartheid in South Africa. But the solution is basically that the United States, if it wants a nuclear deal, it has to abide by that deal, and that the U.S. regime has to verify its acts as well.
Okay, Hillary, last word to you. Where do things head to next?
I think that the longer the United States has delayed doing what it needs to do to come back into compliance with the JCPOA by lifting all of the sanctions that Trump imposed, the longer the United States delays that, the more violence we're going to see in the Middle East, a region that President Biden clearly wants to step away from and to look more towards China and to U.S. domestic issues. I think what the Israelis have done will backfire, as it did in the 2010 to 2013 period. It will push the United States to have to make this very clear decision to keep standing with Israel, to pursue these policies that are very much against stability and a path toward diplomacy, or the United States is going to have to really sit up get to the table, do a serious job of negotiating with Iran, and lift the sanctions that President Trump illegally imposed after the deal had been signed. It's a clear choice that the Israelis are forcing on the United States. I'm not sure that the Biden administration will opt for the serious path toward diplomacy. That's something we really need to take into account. But the Israelis are pushing very hard for that decision.
Thank you so much. We'll have to leave it there. Mohammed Morandi for joining us from Tehran, Meir Javedanfar from Tel Aviv, and Hillary Mann Leverett. Thank you so much from Washington, D.C., and thanks for watching. You can watch the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can join the conversation on Twitter as well. Our handle is AJ Inside Story. For myself and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching, and bye-bye for now.